Okay, this is a continuation of the white shirt series on tolerances of orientation. I told you in the previous video that we had the added complication of the requirement for a datum in tolerances of orientation. There is a video on datums and the two different types, datum features and datum targets. In all instances here, pretty much in this class, we're going to be talking about datum features. Again, datum targets are a specialized niche for those types of components that don't have a lot of features but still have to be oriented in space and constrained. And they're used in the case of like foreign parts, castings, that sort of thing that don't have really good features that we can use as a datum. Okay, so I have learned something about the video camera. It looks like I'm sort of limited to 30 minutes of runtime before the thing shuts itself off or starts another video. So if some of the videos up to this point have been clipped, that's why. So I'm going to be looking at my watch periodically here just to make sure I stay within that 30-minute session, and then I'll start a new video. Okay, so we're heading into the next level of complexity with tolerances of orientation. As I explained to you, we do need the orientation is always a comparison between one feature and the other, what its relationship is, and that relationship is always an angular relationship. So we say that tolerances of orientation and the controls deal with rotational degrees of freedom, and they limit them. So if I had a feature that was supposed to be 90 degrees to another feature and I didn't control it, it could rotate this way or it could rotate this way, and I use the orientation controls to limit it to a certain amount of rotation. We only have three symbols that we have to deal with. We have the perpendicularity symbol, the parallelism symbol, and the angularity symbol. And I think I explained in an earlier video, more and more people are realizing in the standards business that these are really specialized cases. This is a 90-degree angle, this is a 0 degree or 180-degree angle, and the overall control is angularity. And so this will fit into that, this will fit into that, and you could make the argument, do I need a special symbol for these other two cases? Maybe, maybe not. The fact is though that certainly parallelism and perpendicularity are key controls in mechanical devices, and I like to have them. I think they focus your attention on what's really essential there. But that said, you could do away with them without too much trouble. Okay, so if you've gone to Canvas, you should see that there is a handout. It is a scan of the chapter on angularity or orientation in the standard, and I'm going to kind of go through some of these examples. Probably not all of them, but certainly some of them. And we're going to sort of explain why this is a fundamentally different control and form. And since it deals only with orientation, we have to be careful about what we think we're controlling. We are controlling only angular degrees of freedom. So translational degrees of freedom are not controlled by this symbol. And if we need to do a translational control, we have to use a different control. And I'll show you what that means here in just a minute. It isn't at all obvious, and that's really the part that you have to learn internally yourself, that your focus has to be on what is the degree of freedom that I'm controlling. Am I controlling all the degrees of freedom that I need to, or too many? Either case could apply. All right, so let's look at figure 6.1 here. And this is an excellent example of a very straightforward angularity control. And since it's straightforward, I'm going to drag it out and turn it into a long-winded session, so we'll probably won't get too far into this, but everything that we talk about on this one example is going to apply on other controls. So I'm going to draw this this part up here, since it is so simple. Okay, so all in this one example, we are seeing much of what is different about orientation than form. The thing that is the same, and is going to be the same with all the GD&T controls, is we are establishing a tolerance zone. What the size of, what the nature of it is, and in this case what its orientation is what we have to define in the feature control frame. And here's the feature control frame, and as you can see there's not a whole lot in there, but from this we should be able to establish what the nature of the tolerance zone is. We know that we are dealing with an angularity control. We can kind of sense that with the 30-degree notation here, 30-degree dimension. I said that datums are new. We are going to have to put a datum in, so we have put a datum in the little square block here. Now again, we'll have an opportunity later to add other datums, and those datums are going to be used to control other degrees of freedom. Later on in another example, we are going to control 2 rotational degrees of freedom instead of, in this case, just 1. Okay, and we have a datum feature. We have the datum feature symbol. We have the little sticky foot here, colored in this case. As I said, that doesn't matter whether that sticky foot is colored in or not colored in. It's the same old sticky foot, and all it does is tell you what the datum surface is. Let's see if we can take this, this feature control frame and now sort of turn it into words. We have a tolerance zone that is at a orientation of 30 degrees. The tolerance zone is 400 thousandths or 0.4 millimeters, however you want to visualize it, relative to A. That's as simple as it can be. Now let's see if we can turn those words into a picture. And I'm going to draw what this means, and let's see what we are really controlling here. Okay, so we have a 0.4 tolerance zone. That tolerance zone is 2 parallel planes, 400 thousandths apart, equally distributed about the perfect geometry. Let's visit this notion of perfect geometry and see what that really means now, because I know this is a totally new concept. It only comes up in GD&T. We're always used to having the tolerance and the dimension sort of mixed up together, and I said early on that we are going to separate those. The dimension and the tolerance are 2 different things. This is a perfect example of where GD&T is separating the tolerance from the dimension. The dimension is supposed to describe exactly what you want. That's what this is doing. Now you'll notice that that dimension is in a box. That is your reminder that you will have a tolerance, but you do not look for the dimension to give you the tolerance. The tolerance is going to be stated elsewhere. It will be stated in a feature control frame. And that whole notion of drawing a box around a dimension to say, everything within this box is perfect. I don't want you to add or subtract to that dimension based on any tolerance. It is perfect. That is a perfect word, if you ask me, for the concept. Unfortunately, GD&T doesn't use that word. They use another concept, which is basic. So when you see a dimension in a box like this with no tolerance, no plus or minus, no nothing, it tells you that this dimension is to be considered basic. And basic means perfect, and it means that you don't go looking around the dimension for any sort of tolerance. You don't go to the default tolerance block, you don't go to the notes, you start looking for a feature control frame. I like this concept of drawing a box around the dimension and saying this is a basic dimension. Unfortunately, the standard allows you to do it or not to do it. If you don't do it and you're using geometric controls, you are obliged to put a note that says undimensioned tolerances locating true position are basic. So it's sort of a motherhood note. I don't like that. This is a good reminder that you are setting up a perfect framework. Think about it like a perfect framework on which you're going to build a tolerance zone. I've established a perfect 30-degree line here around which I am going to establish a tolerance zone of 400 thousandths, plus or minus 200. You'll notice that the tolerance zone starts where the feature starts, ends where the feature ends, and that's it. That is the tolerance zone. Now I'm going to explain what that's controlling here in just a minute, but before that I want to complicate things a little bit. I'm going to take this out of the way here because I want to draw what that tolerance zone would be if we did not use an orientation control, if we used the old-fashioned way of plus or minus, in this case, an angular amount. So if I Okay, so in the old pre-GD&T days, that would have been tolerance right by the dimension, and the tolerance would have been 30 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. Now, GD&T didn't invent tolerance zones, it just gave us a way to define them and control them a little bit better. There's a tolerance zone associated with this old school plus or minus tolerance. And let's see what that is. It's definitely not these two parallel planes that this establishes. I'll take this out of here too so you don't get confused. I said an angle is a rotation. It's a rotation of this surface relative to the datum surface A. What are we rotating about? There's always a point that you rotate from. There's always a center point. Well, let's continue this surface out. And where those two surfaces intersect, there's a point, a geometric point. And that is the rotation point for those two surfaces. And in the old school way of doing things, we would interpret the tolerance zone from this position right here. So our tolerance zone would look like this. It would be 30 degrees. Well, this is a perfect 30 degrees. You get plus a degree, and you get minus a degree. And you get a tolerance zone, but what is it? it's not what the GD&T one is. It's not parallel. It doesn't start where the feature starts and end where the feature ends. It starts way over here. And here's the really unfortunate thing about this, and when we talk about angles in metrology, we say this is a source of a significant amount of error because we have an amplification factor here. And that amplification factor is the further away we get from this rotational point, the wider that tolerance zone gets. So the tolerance zone is whatever it is here, and it's less here. So we have an unequal tolerance zone. If this is a large part, and there's a long distance between where this point pivots, let's say this angle were much less steep, that would throw that pivot point way out here, and a plus or minus 1 degree would yield a much larger tolerance zone. That's not a good thing. To have a tolerance zone that can be much larger than you might imagine is a real problem. So this is really one of the strengths of GD&T is that it takes a non-uniform tolerance zone that has a divergence, a variation from one point of the feature to the next, and makes it regular. So if we take that out, make this basic again, we get a nice uniform, even plus or minus 200 thousandths, total 400 thousandths wide tolerance zone. It is oriented perfectly relative to 30 degrees, and it's as simple as that, except for the fact that that tolerance zone here isn't fixed like the previous one was. If you remember, that tolerance zone started right at that fixed point. That is a fixed point in space geometrically, so that tolerance zone always starts there. In the case of an orientation control, though, we don't have that locking in of the position of that tolerance zone. Why is that so? I want you to imagine, of course there are no dimensions on this illustration here, but imagine that you made one part that looked just like the drawing, perfect part, 30 degrees, all these dimensions are exactly as drawn. The next part you make, you mill this surface down a little bit more, and that part looks like that. It has the same angularity control, same tolerance zone, same datum, but the surface now is significantly lower than the perfect part. The tolerances may allow that. You may have a wide tolerance on what the height of this is, and this may still even be a perfect 30-degree angle. But the tolerance zone originally was up here, and now it needs to move down to where the actual surface is. And it does. The tolerance zone, in this case, since it is controlling only the orientation or the rotation of that surface, is free to float and try to find that surface. Once it has done that, once it has floated down and we try to fit the feature within this tolerance, I'm going to actually, let me draw this up a little bit larger. Once that tolerance zone sort of drifts down to where the actual feature is, now we got another issue that we want to make sure that we're careful about and mindful of. Obviously, in this case, the tolerance zone, since it floats to wherever the feature is, it doesn't control where that feature is. It has nothing to do with where the position of that feature is. That angular feature can be up, it can be down, or it can be in the perfect location. It does not control size. It does not control position of that feature. It simply controls the orientation. But if you remember, I said once you put a tolerance zone up, and if that's the only control that you've put up, if that's the only control on that surface, on this surface, is an angularity control, that tolerance zone controls everything else, unless otherwise specified. So, how flat can this surface be? There's no flatness control. We know it's a planar surface, or intended to be a planar surface at a 30-degree angle. And we've given a fairly large tolerance zone for that feature to float around in. As a control, then it prevents, or it allows the feature to tip that way, or anywhere in between that surface. But it also allows this. It also allows this surface to do that. In other words, once you set up a tolerance zone, it is also controlling the flatness of that. If we want to control the flatness, we have to put another control on that surface. We have to put a flatness control. Once we establish the flatness of that feature, then we can worry about what its angularity is, and maybe even later we'll worry about where its position is. But these are completely separate aspects of those features. Obviously, the flatness control is not going to reference the datum. The angularity control must reference the datum and must define the tolerance zone. So we can have actually two tolerance zones. We can have a fairly large angularity tolerance zone, and let's say a fairly tight flatness or form tolerance zone. So this is where the distinction between translational degrees of freedom and rotational degrees of freedom become important. Is that if this surface is drifting up and down, that is a positional or a translational problem. It has to be controlled separately. If the surface is wobbly or not flat, that's a form problem. Its orientation or its rotation about relative to this surface is an orientation problem, and it is controlled by this. Okay, I'm going to terminate this this video here. I'm watching my time. I think I'm going to clip out here in just a minute. On a subsequent video, we will go through these a little bit more. I want you to pay particular attention to these. I want you to read through this whole chapter and look at all these examples and look at the means this portion of it. I think it's very useful. Again, one of the real strengths of the standard is that you can see exactly what the tolerance zone is intended to be. Now, there's a couple weird little things here that I'll definitely have to cover, but this will get you started on orientation.